Have you looked at the bit.ly link? If anyone out here has something on that link that looks particularly interesting, then we can talk about it now. We only have about 40 minutes, so this will be lightning fast. And if there's no takers, then I'm going to show you something cool. Don't worry. Anybody want to raise their hand? They see something in the list?
I saw something not on the list.
The list isn't long enough for Scott. Okay.
You learned it, so I'm curious about just like major changes in like whatever I call a React project. There's big dependencies. Just like how do you decide which of the 5 flavors of any given tool in React you use?
Okay, so Scott's question is, how do you pick your dependencies effectively? I mean, when you say dependencies, are you talking about component libraries? Talking about how to make HTTP calls, automated testing?
Yeah, you got, I mean, so I need to pick, do I use Redux or, like, you even just seen state management libraries change over the years. You had your course on Flux and decided to do this and then Redux. So, like, as those things evolve, how do you work?
Okay, although you just kind of pivoted into state management, which is a subset of the conversation. I mean, basically your questions, that could be a talk in of itself. How do we pick all our dependencies for our apps? For starters, I use Create React App. I mean, years ago I created React Slingshot because Create React App didn't exist. It's got almost 10,000 stars on GitHub. My suggestion is don't touch it, don't use it, because Facebook's Create React App is better. Once it came out, I stopped using my own stuff because, what do you know, Facebook's better. And they have a full-time staff that's making it better every day. But it's still out there. Now, with state management, it's weird. So I author courses on Pluralsight. Anybody use Pluralsight in here? Awesome. Is it useful? 2 people said yes. That's wonderful. So my most popular course on Pluralsight by far is my Redux course. And it's interesting because generally I tell people don't use Redux. And I don't say that because it's not useful, but I do believe that simplicity is something to strive for. And I think that as developers, an epidemic that I'm seeing as a consultant, because effectively where I spend most of my time today is going into companies that are moving from Angular, from jQuery, from Ember, from plain old JavaScript, and saying we want to move to React, or people that are working in Java or .NET and they've decided to finally do client-side development and move to React. The thing that I'm seeing is people feel like they need to use Redux because if I don't use Redux, I'm not building an enterprise app. Or if I don't use Redux, it's not going to be on my resume, if you want to be completely honest. There are people that just want to be able to say they know it. And so I encourage people to start out with just plain React. Use React's native state and try to just put the state as low as you can. So when I say as low as you can, what does that mean to people? What's low mean? Yeah, in a component. So you start out saying which component needs this, and of course, if we go to declare state, obviously one component needs it, and at some point, you're going to have 2 components that need it. And a pattern that I always end up charting with these teams that are using Redux, it surprises me almost without fail when I say, how often do you all lift state? They look at me blank and say, what do you mean by lifting state? And then we go to the board and we chart that. And I don't have a whiteboard here, but lifting state, what does that mean? Who in here is comfortable with that term as a React developer? Okay, so that's a minority in the room here. This is not my own term, this is in the React docs, but if you haven't read the React docs recently, then you might not know it's there if you learned React years ago. So lifting state is this idea of saying, I have a component right here that needs user data, and then I have this other component in a completely different part of the application that also needs that user data, and the question is, how do they both use this data? And what you do is you say, where's the common parent? So I go up the tree, and in a smaller app, the common parent might be your app component, the very top level component. In other apps, you might find, no, there's a child component, there's a parent component that is a child of the app that's maybe partially down the tree. So by putting the state as low as I can, I end up improving performance, keeping my application simpler. So when I talk about a React app being a tree, think about a tree that's turned upside down though, because your app component, traditionally, if I was going to come up here and chart out your app, I'd draw a circle at the top and I'd label it app, and then I'd start labeling all of the pages off of your app, and those all have child pages, so it ends up looking like a tree. But the idea of keeping your state low is, if you can keep it down there at the leaf nodes, that's good. This principle of least privilege is a general software development term that's really useful. And the reason that it's useful is, well, one thing for security, you say, I don't want anyone else to be able to access this data because they don't need it. So we want to avoid creating globals for security reasons, but also in React for performance reasons, because the more components that access that state, the more components re-render when that state changes. So I put the state up here in the app. If state changes in the app, what re-renders? All the things, and that's bad. Whereas if I had it down where it was only necessary, then only that one component renders instead. So that's the win. There are other useful, interesting options out there in state management. MobX is interesting. Context, which is built into React, is interesting. And in fact, I recommend to teams, reach for context before you go reaching for Redux. Remember the history of Redux. So who created Redux? Dan Abramoff. And you all know him because you all obviously follow him on Twitter. I mean, like everybody follows him on Twitter. And Dan created Redux, became really popular, and he created it just so he could do a conference talk at a React event. And he wanted to do time travel debugging, so Redux was really a way to do time travel debugging. It was the core thing he wanted to solve. But the interesting thing that happened was it became so popular that he became a superstar. And not surprisingly, Facebook offered him a job. He takes the job. And when he joined, one of the things he said was, you know, I'd really like for React to be able to solve this problem natively. And that's precisely what context is an answer to what Redux was doing externally. So I would encourage you to lean toward context if you find that you have global data. And by global data, what are examples of truly global data in an app? Anybody call out some ideas? Yeah.
User login profile.
Yeah, I need to know, almost all my components care who's logged in, because I might want to hide and show things based on whether I'm an admin or a plain old user or I'm unauthenticated or my account is locked. That's a great example. Where else? What other things are truly global?
Routing.
Routing is, yeah, that's pretty darn global too. It's a good example.
Locale?
Locale, like where the person is.
Language?
Oh, language, yeah, internationalization, more broadly, is a good example. Also, theming is another example. But that list basically fits on one hand. What I see people, the largest mistake that I'm seeing in React right now are people taking local data and making it global. And they do that either via context, or via Redux, or via putting the state up at the top, where it really doesn't need to be. So, those sorts of things that we just talked about do apply to everybody, but most of the state doesn't. Did that address your question, Scott?
That is a very good deviation. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. So it used to be a package, now it's more React, it's a native built in.
Yes.
It's like as the ecosystems evolve, you depend on less things.
Yeah, so Scott was summarizing my point as React has basically added more features in over time where there's less of a need to reach for things like MobX and Redux. And I tend to agree as well, although MobX is a very different conversation than Redux. But Redux in particular is replaced largely by context. Yeah?
So I remember on the React project I was working on, one of the big pain points I came across coming from more of an Angular background was the props changing. So I know there's like the deprecated on props did change.
Yeah.
And I found myself basically essentially reaching for that, but you know, the React website kind of slapping your hand and saying, no, don't do that. So do you have any advice around that specific kind of dynamic and ways to do that?
So your question is basically the pain point around when props change, I want my component to re-render, and often what happens is you've got props passed into a component and then you're copying those props into state because you need to change those because some form is changing the data that comes in. A good example of this might be you're going to edit a user on a form. So you've got a component that takes a user on props, but then you've got a form that changes that user's data, so you need to copy what's in props and store it in state so that you can have some backing store for when I hit the letter K, the state changes. Now the thing you run into is, well, what if the props passed in on that component have changed? Now now my state and my props, I've got to reconcile this. There was a wonderful post that was once called, "You probably don't need get-derived state from props." Anybody read that one? It's got a mouthful of a name. They've renamed it since because now we're in the land of function components instead of class components. So that lifecycle method reference wasn't as useful. There's a simple takeaway from that post, which I liked, was using keys to force a garbage collection on your component. And I really do mean to say garbage collection. So this is a very underutilized pattern. I rarely see it, but if you're in a situation where you want your component to be completely re-rendered, you want the old instance garbage collected, and you want it as though the person had just reloaded the page, a good way to do that is to put a key on that component, because any time that a key changes, that's your signal to React to say, throw the old thing in the trash. This is the new instance that I care about. And you think about why we use keys in the first place. Keys are there because I might have a row of, or I might have a list of users that's 1,000 people high. And if I remove user 500 from that list, I don't want to re-render 500 rows down below just because the array index shifted by one. And that's the way that naive implementations and frameworks used to do things. Knockout did this, Backbone did this, jQuery did this, Angular added trackby to solve this, React added keys to solve this, because the key becomes your unique identifier for that row. So even though the data might change, it doesn't impact things. So I tend to use keys for what you're talking about there. The other pattern that is useful, though, is to say, I'm getting data on props, and then I need to change it down here in the form. Well, what if instead of having the state handled down here in this component, I have the state handled up in the parent? And now what I'm passing down is the data and a change handler. So now I don't have to worry about the out-of-sync. I only have one system of record. And often that actually is preferable. It's a little bit easier than the keys, but often it depends. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. Felt like I needed a whiteboard there. Was there enough hand motion to connect all the dots? Okay, other questions or points off of this long list that looked interesting?
Point number 11.
Point number 11. I haven't memorized these, so let's see what 11 is. Storybook-driven development. Yeah, so Storybook. Who in here is using Storybook? Wow, hardly anyone. Really? Or are y'all just tired of me asking questions? That blows my mind. Okay, who here has tried Storybook? Okay, a lot more hands. So we've got a bunch of disillusioned Storybook people. Why did you stop? You raised your hand. Why did you stop using Storybook?
I basically just ran out of time.
Got busy. Okay.
Updated version and then wrote some stuff.
Well, I will say, handling that has been frustrating. So for those that aren't familiar with Storybook, Storybook is a way to quickly document your components. And this little GIF shows it off nicely. So the place that Storybook's most useful is reusable components. And I don't mean a reusable component library that you're sharing across your company and used by dozens of projects, although yes, that is a use case. Another simple use case is in your app, you have components that are used on many different pages, and the question is, if I join your team right now, how do I know where your reusable components are? How do I know how they work? How do I know what those props do? And with Storybook, I have the ability to answer that question. So this is their little GIF on it, but I can just as easily. So I've been doing work for Discover for the last many months, and they are completely rewriting Discover.com. This is Discover, the credit card is probably what you think of, but they do a lot more than credit cards. And we have a monorepo. I'm a big fan of monorepos, and that's a larger topic too. I am curious, who in here is working with React in a monorepo? Hardly anyone. 4 or 5 hands. And you all are probably on the same team because you're sitting by each other. So it doesn't even count. No, you don't? Okay, we'll count both of yours then. I'm going to say 5. I feel like there should be a talk on a mono repo sometime soon. One of the people that raised their hand should totally do it and say why you love it. Are you happy with your mono repo? Heads nod. So, and that's one of the biggest shifts that I've found really helps people go. So here's a bunch of reusable components. And I come in here and I say, okay, which one's of interest? Well, I want to look at form inputs and kind of see how they work. How does the form input work here at Discover? You can see this one has sort of a material UI look and feel about it. So I put in focus and it animates and I can type in here. And if I had a required field, then yeah, I can come in here and notice that the difference is the label no longer says optional. So they label optional fields as optional and required doesn't have that. So I can get a sense of these sorts of things. But I can also toy around with the different props in here quite easily. I can see how the errors are. So you can see how Storybook lets me understand how to interact with the app, these components right away. And it documents all of our usable components in the project. And this sits in the same repository as our different applications, so it's a mono repository. And you think about, the reason that a monorepo becomes so valuable is, if I come in and I change the text input, who did I break, potentially? Everyone, because every single app in our company uses the text input. It's ubiquitous, it's super useful. So if I'm going to make a breaking change to this API, ideally, I would also update all of the call sites and make a single atomic commit where all my tests pass, CI is happy, life is good. But that's very difficult to do if I have a bunch of separate repositories. So this conversation on mono repositories. A monorepo need not mean that you take all your company's code and you put it in a repository. I don't actually recommend that, although Google is doing that. And if Google can do that at their scale, their scale is so big that Git literally fell down. They had to build their own source control system to hold all of their code, because you're talking about terabytes of source code. Now, what I'm suggesting though is, if you have multiple React apps at your company, who has multiple React apps right now? Lots of hands. If you have multiple React apps, then it makes sense for you to put all of those in one repository. And the reason that I say that is, those multiple React apps are probably all using the same text input. They're probably all using the same date picker and time picker and tab control and accordions. And if they're not, I would say, why not? You could save a lot of money by reusing that. If you can choose once and make it good, then you can move faster. And that's the core win of React. That's why we're in here and excited about React, is it makes components so easy. It allows us to quickly reuse. Now, the original question, which I've diverted from a bit, was, what is Storybook-driven development? Well, when you look at Storybook here, I'm running a single component all by itself. So Storybook-driven development is the idea of, I may have this big app and it's intimidating, it's slow to start. Every time I hit save, it takes a long time to compile because the bundle has gotten huge, so there's a lot of JS that's getting called by Webpack behind the scenes. But what if instead I could build in isolation? And I can do that with Storybook. So I could open up the text input story over here, and I could change that story in isolation. And I know here are my, let's see how my font size here is. Is that big enough? Okay. So these are my stories, and you can see that Storybook has a very concise way of declaring a story. I give it a name. This is automatically sentence cased for me. So with string help text that you see right there gets converted over to, oh, wrong way. Let's go over here. Gets converted over to with string help text like this. So you can see that the name of the variable that I declared is used by convention to name the story. So it's very low friction to work in Storybook. And I can come in here and I can run this text input example component, and I can change it all by myself and change the values. And when I hit save, then I come back over here and I can see that change immediately. And that change is immediate because I'm just running this one component all by itself. I don't have any kind of friction there. And A React component, ideally, if it's reusable, it's a pure function. What's a pure function? Yeah.
Given the same inputs, it will always output the same output.
Given the same input, it will always have the same output. Yes. So no side effects. What's a side effect? Sort of an unintended change, something that changes outside of the function. So you think about if I create an add function over here, that function ideally is going to be pure. If I declare function add and it accepts x and y and it returns x plus y, what I just created is a pure function. Think about add right there. I could call that as many times as I want and it will always return the same result given a certain input. Does it change any global state? Does it depend on any global state? Does it have any side effects? When I can say no to all of those things, how easy is this to test? I write a test that says, given that I pass 1 and 2, I always get 3. Now, you look at this and you go, yeah, well, of course, this is simple code. That makes it easy to test, and it's easy to write a pure function for something so stupid. But what if you're doing something complex? Well, your React components often are pure functions. Props are arguments to the function. And what does it return? A bunch of JSX. So given these props, I should always get this output. And this is one of the nice things about writing as many pure functions as you can, building a lot of, I call them dumb components, and I don't mean that in the pejorative, I just mean they don't have logic built in, they don't ideally have state. Given this input, I always get this HTML out the other side. That lets me test a lot of this and work with it in isolation. Okay, did I cover the storybook-driven development thing? What else?
Number 5, if you don't mind, a tool-related question.
Number 5, let's go see what number 5 is. Where was my list? Quickly view list of parents. Use React DevTools.
So,
Okay.
this is great, like, if you're just looking at where you're at. Let's say you started a new job, you're looking in a project where everything's unsquirrely, the folder structure doesn't match your component dependency.
Yeah.
Is there a tool out there for analyze my entire source code directory, show me what components there are and where they're used? Is there such a thing?
So basically, his question is there a tool that lets me visualize all the components that are used within an application?
Kind of
And also their relationships?
Yeah, a little
So
bit
almost
like
to be able to visualize your app's tree?
yeah, like a GraphDB model
Yeah.
of your React.
I have not found one, and in fact, I've tweeted out about it a few times, hoping that somebody would find something, and I don't know that it exists. And that's also why this is on my list, is if I'm running a React application, what I look for is, or what I use is the React DevTools. So if I come over here, let me just open an application. The React DevTools were fairly recently updated, and they finally do give us visualization of parent-child relationships, and we can also always see what the parent component is doing. I just realized I should have opened a few more tabs before speaking, just so I'd be prepared. You know what's embarrassing is this is not my only browser instance right now either, so. Okay, it's been a busy day. So if I want to come in here and look at the tree of components, I come down here and I open the React DevTools, and I can see that this table cell right up here was rendered by the table row. And I can even, well, let me size this way up. Oh, now I have gone too far. How's that? Big enough? Okay. So I can see that it was rendered by table row. Table row was rendered by data table. Enrolled pays table was rendered by eBills. And I can click on any one of these to jump up in the tree. So this is giving me sort of a picture of what I think you're asking and what I'm looking for too. But I would love to see a VS Code extension to just let me see the tree. That would be very handy. But this is the closest that I found, and that's what I was getting at in this point is I used to, before the DevTools did this, I used to just go in and start running the app and looking at what imports what. I will say one thing that's useful though. if I'm over in, say, let me just go to a component like reminders. Okay, so here's a component. What if I want to know, I want to navigate to the parent component? The easiest way that I found to do that, at least in VS Code, is to hit Command-Shift-F and then search for, look, I'd actually done this recently, and then search for the JSX reference to it, which would be reminder component. So I can see reminders right down here, it shows up in the list, and now when I click this, now I'm in the parent component at the call site, and I can get to those props. Has anybody found a quicker way to get to the parent that's calling the component that you're looking at? Because that's my technique now. Scott has the answer.
If you're using the TypeScript, then you would just go like find usages and then go there.
Yeah, so in TypeScript you could right click. Well, and actually, you don't have to be in TypeScript either to do what you're describing. I could go to, let's see where it is. I could go to, where is the actual component? This, I don't like this setup, but I didn't do this. So this is, now this I want to emphasize, one of the downsides. I typically like one component per file for this reason, because notice what I'm feeling right now. I'm looking for the reminders component so I can show you guys, and what am I doing? I'm goofing around collapsing a bunch of other things that have been put in here. Now, this is a sort of religious debate, and here lately we seem to have whipsawed toward people saying, just put a whole bunch of stuff in the same file. It doesn't matter because a separate file doesn't really buy you anything. To me it does. I want to know that when I open reminders, that I'm looking at the reminders component so that to me, as I'm scrolling up and down, I'm not jumping around into different contexts and going, what is this component? Even if it's only used once, I tend to like to put it in a separate file because my navigation gets a little bit easier. I don't mind jumping between files, but I like to be modal. So that's one of the advantages of it. Because you can see here now that I'm feeling the pain of, okay, where is the reminders component actually declared in here? Now I finally found it down here on 187. I shouldn't have to go down to line 187 to find the component that's named after the file. So, anybody else feel this way? Good, all right. And the exact other half of the room completely disagreed with me. That's what's fun about this topic, it's trade-offs, where to put things. But yes, I could be able to right-click on remind. Stop helping me, stop helping me. I just want, I may actually have to zoom out in hopes that I can, there we go. So I can find all references right here. And find all references is also useful for that sort of thing. And we can see that the container references it. And here's the import, here's the other. So 2 different ways to do it. Yeah, so you don't need TypeScript for that. Yeah?
I saw that you used hooks, or maybe not you, I guess, but there was hooks in some of the code that you were just showing.
Yes.
And hooks, I always liked the component style of managing state because it felt kind of more like structured and rigid. So do you have any advice about using like this use state hooks? The use state hook, I guess, mainly, and when to use that, or is it just purely like taste?
So your question is, when should I use the use state hook?
Is there a reason to other than just I like this like stylistic preference?
Well, when should I use the use state hook as opposed to?
A component like a React component that has internal state.
Like a class component?
Yeah, like a class component as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, so more broadly, to me, class components are dead. And I've been advising my clients to avoid class components, to basically consider them deprecated, even though Facebook has not said this, the React team has not said this, but to me the writing's on the wall. And I say this as somebody who was working in React early enough to remember you couldn't even, the way that I created components early on was by calling a function called create class. Did anybody work in the create class era? A few hands. Yep, we all have gray hair to show it. And that was a painful time to work in React because create React app didn't exist. You had to set up your own dev environment. It was very time consuming. But when React finally said, you know what, create class is no longer the way we're going to do it, we're going to embrace JavaScript classes as they're built in, what happened was they said, well, we're going to pull the create class feature out of React. And now, if you want to use create class today, you still can, but you have to pull in another library to do it. fast forward a little bit later. Remember when prop types were part of React? They were baked in. Well, eventually they realized, you know what? Lots of people, the hipsters like Scott, are using TypeScript. I like hipsters. And TypeScript is really good. And the thing is, if you're going to use TypeScript, you don't need prop types. So they took prop types, they extracted it from React. That was a breaking change, but a very minor one. It just meant you had to import prop types at the top of each one of your files if you're going to stay in prop types land. So my prediction is React 17 will kill the class. And I don't mean kill it dead where you have to rewrite. I mean you will have to add an import at the top of all your class components that says import React-class, something like that. And I say that because one of the things that React is up against now with a headwind is Svelte. Anybody tried Svelte? You like it?
Yeah, it's really fast.
It's pretty compelling. And as a guy who has put a lot of my career into React, it's a little scary. To me, it is the most compelling thing that I have seen since React. I'm not moving to it though, because I think all things considered, it doesn't make sense. I think there are a lot of reasons that we're all in this room talking about React and not Svelte, not the least of which is React is supported by Facebook, React has a full-time team. If I want a component on just about anything, I can go find it, I don't have to reinvent it. I have this massive ecosystem. Also, you have the, you never get fired for choosing IBM problem here. If you tell your boss you want to use React, it's an easy sell. If you say Svelte, it's highly unproven. Who's supporting this? This random guy that lives in New York that works for the New York Times but isn't actually paid full-time to do it. It's not near the same firm foundation. It's a community project compared to one of the largest companies in the world. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's why I say technical merits aren't enough to pivot everybody to something else. You need all those other things. You need the documentation in the community to justify shifting over. I just got on such a soapbox, I don't even remember what I was talking about. What were we talking about?
Class components.
Class components, I'm sorry. So class components, I predict the same thing will happen. And my advice to everybody is, don't touch your class components, don't go in and rewrite them. If they're running, leave them running. But when you lift the hood, if you have to do significant work, I would shift them over to functions because they are the future. And in my experience, every time that I shift over from a class to a function component, that diff, it's less code. Notably less code in some cases. And the other thing that you see is, I love this visualization. Let me fire this up. So for anybody who, when I started doing consulting full time, one of the things that I put a lot of work into was creating a GitHub repo with issues that let me collect everything that I see on the web that is useful. And I made all this open source. If you go out to github.com/CoryHouse/ReactJS Consulting, there are GitHub issues out here, and you might think, why would I want to read Cory's issues? He clearly has many. I have at least 28 issues right now. The reason that you want to read them is I use GitHub issues to collect information on given topics. So if I come over here to issues, what you'll see is I have topics, high level, on all sorts of different things, like React Router, media queries, finite state machines, how to work with CSS and Flexbox and TypeScript. All of these have interesting links that I have found useful. But if I go into React Fundamentals, which is exactly where I was a moment ago, there's a link in here under hooks, in this section on hooks, this visual comparison of class versus hooks code. Oh, this is an amazing blog post, and not actually the one that I was looking for, though. I would highly recommend looking at this, if for no other reason than this is one of the most beautiful blog posts I've ever seen. I mean, she put a ton of work into this thing, and it really is a wonderful way to contrast the two. But there is a shorter example. There we go. Sunil tweeted this out. And, I'm going to do it this way so I can show you the difference. So here's the conversion from a class component to a function component. And what he did was he deliberately colored related items. So he said, I'm going to color all the events in yellow, I'm going to color all of the state in blue, and I'm going to color all of the context-related code in green. Then I'm going to mark every place that I say the word this in black, because it is basically, well, this or lifecycle methods, because the black up there represents cruft, noise. Literally, the only reason it exists is because the API and class components requires it to be there. So things like component did mount, component should update, the constructor itself, those sorts of things. So what you see is a few takeaways. One thing is, wow, this is less code, that's attractive. But more importantly, oh wow, look at how related things are placed together. And we know, so if you've never seen this talk, anybody watched Rich Hickey's talk, Simple Made Easy? Only one hand. So if there is one talk that I would recommend that you watch, that's not it, but it is a really good one. No, it is an awesome talk. So what Rich talks about is taking what is complexity. We use the term complexity all the time. We say, I just made this easier or more elegant. Well, complexity is intertwining concerns. And he talks about rope that way, that it's complex. And undoing that knot would be extremely difficult. So one way to fight complexity is by putting related things together. This fights complexity. So before, we had related things here, 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 and here. Look how spread out that is. That creates mental load. That also makes me more likely to make a mistake. Whereas here in the function component using hooks, all of my state is handled in this one little section. That is less complexity. It's less intertwined. So by that definition, function components are a win. So who in here has decided, I'm only writing function components? Lots of hands. And you were keeping your hand up. I saw you raised your hand too. So that's good to see. For those that are staying in classes, is there anybody that is not allowed to write a function component because you're in too old of a version? That's one obvious reason. And there are, I understand, some reasons you can't upgrade. Are there other reasons people are staying on classes for now? Just curious. Yeah.
There are some features that aren't supported by hooks, like error boundaries, right? So you need to use some of those features, you'll still have to use classes, right?
So it is true that you cannot declare an error boundary using a class. There is one other feature in React that requires you to use a class, and I don't know what it is because in 5 years I haven't needed it. It's in their docs, and I can't even remember what it is. Their docs list error boundaries and other thing that Cory doesn't use. Maybe it's great, but I haven't found a use for it. So that is true. When I declare an error boundary, I have to use a class. If you look through Discover's code base right now, we have literally hundreds of components and one class. The one class is the error boundary that we declared, because we had to there. Yes?
There are actual performance differences between class and function components as well, correct?
There are performance differences between class and function components. In theory, function components are faster because they eliminate some of the overhead of class components, and in theory they make it even faster. I wouldn't choose based on the performance thing because it's such a minor thing. And that I'm basically parroting what the React team says as well. There are other good reasons. To me, this is the most compelling sales pitch for function components is you're going to write code faster and it'll be easier to understand. Yeah?
I'm going to steal all the questions, but micro front ends, have you used React as part of micro front ends, as part of larger websites where React is just a small piece, and if so, what's your approach?
Oh man, you asked me a question about micro front ends and I've got 2 minutes left. That's like dropping dynamite right here.
True.
Let's talk after.
Sure.
I want to honor everybody's time. So I didn't get to show you the cool thing that I wanted to show you, but that's great because you guys asked good questions. Was this useful? Did y'all learn some stuff? Wonderful. Wonderful. I can't tell if that's a pity clap, but I will take it. Yeah. So I feed my kids via doing this. So React training and consulting is what I do. I travel around the country. I'm working with a lot of companies in Kansas City, actually, on at least a part-time basis. So you can reach out to me here. I help train teams, but I also often just do code reviews and architectural planning. If you all have hard problems, you want to talk to somebody outside of your company, ping me. I am independent, so my days involve working out and waiting for people to call me. So, yeah. Also, I have a lot of courses on Pluralsight. Obviously, a lot of you use it. There's a free trial if you don't have it. Also, ask your boss to pay for it because they should. Education's important. It's useful. You can reach me also on Twitter. My handle is HouseCore, and I'm done 1 minute early. So I will hang out up here and talk shop, and we can talk micro front ends and anything else you want. Because hey, I work from home. This is my social outlet, you all. So, thanks for having me, everybody.